What on earth is going on in this country? What is going to happen with Joe Biden? How did the Democrats get into this pickle? Is their goose completely cooked? Hello out there in podcast land. This is Rui Teixeira, the host of the Liberal Patriot podcast, coming at you with one of our bi-weekly podcasts. As the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times, and we do live in interesting times. And as part of that, at our podcast, I try to bring the very finest in heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And today, I'm totally delighted to have my old pal, Henry Olsen, here to talk about all things political with me. Henry is a senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. He writes for National Review Online and also for the New York Post and various other outlets. And he has a podcast, Beyond the Polls. So you should totally check him out. And I think you maintain a pretty active Twitter feed, right, Henry?
I do.
Yeah. Okay. So there's ways to check him out there as well. But at any rate, the thing you should do now is don't worry about any of that stuff. You should be listening to this and what we're going to get into. So Henry, I guess the first question I want to ask you is, why is populism so damn popular? What is it about that strain of politics that seems to be, so potent today? And is it on the decline? Is it on the rise? I mean, I know some people will look at least some of the recent results and say, maybe it's being tamped down, successfully contained. What do you think?
Well, I think the end of the populist moment has occurred 7 times in the last decade, and it will occur another 7 times in the next decade. I think populism is a rational response to the failures of the governing consensus in the period from 1990 to 2010. And as such, it continues to grow in strength, both left and right populism, because the governing consensus has not yet adapted. It is stubbornly resistant to new approaches or rethinking. And as a result, the now standard critiques from left populists, think AOC or Bernie Sanders in America, Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, or Donald Trump or Nigel Farage in the United States or Britain, the standard critiques of those people remain trenchantly insightful and consequently continue to gain traction.
To ask the, $64,000 question, which is probably irresolvable, is this mostly economics or mostly cultural?
Well, I think it is both. I don't think it's hard. It's hard to say mostly in the sense that the sort of people who are responding to this tend to be the sort of people who are both economically and culturally pressed by the governing consensus. They are economically pressed in the sense that they're either losing their jobs or they are at greater risk of losing their jobs or are more economically stagnant. So hence, they are more precariously on the stature/income spectrum than the people who tend to be making the rules. They are also tend to be more culturally conservative. That doesn't mean in an American sense that they are culturally conservative, but they tend to be less open to rapid cultural change. They tend to be more attached to the nation state as a moral entity that confers legitimacy, status, and obligation. And they tend, as a result, to be pushed in both directions. So is it one? Is it the other? I think it's both, and it's very hard to disentangle the two. I do note that countries that have virtually no significant economic pressure also tend to see lower degrees of mass populism. It's not to say it's absent, but Australia has had one shallow recession in 25 years, and its populism is weaker. It's not non-existent, and the cultural strains and the economic pushes that drive it remain present, but it is weaker there than it is, say, in France, which has been economically stagnant for a quarter century.
Okay, let's talk about France. Very interesting recent results there in the election. We had the national rally being the first party in the first round, and also really the first party by popular vote in the second round. It's just their votes were inefficiently distributed because of the sort of united front that was formed against them. So they wound up with only the third amount of seats, even though they had, 37% of the popular vote. So let's talk about that. Does this represent, should we see this as a remarkable surge of populism, or should we instead read it as the Brahmin Left has triumphed? I mean, let me try to explain what I mean by that. If you look at the demographics of the New Popular Front support, it's heavily skewed toward the most, professionals. It's skewed toward the people with the most education. And if you look at the support of the National Rally, it's heavily working class and lower education levels. So it seems like the Brahmin Left has, in a weird sort of way, managed to triumph at the very moment at which the populists were gathering at the gates. What do you think about that? Should we chalk that up as a success of the Brahmin Left, that left that has formed over the last 30 years, which is now skewed away from the working class and toward the most educated segments of the population? This is their moment?
Well, it depends what you mean by success. If the last week of the French election, which is a two-round affair, was basically conducted as a holy alliance between the center-right, the center, and the Brahmin Left, as a hold back the gates against the barbarians, i.e. the National Rally. And to that extent, it was a success. But let's take a look at what the success looks like. The success looks like a popular front that has 180-something seats divided among four major parties with a number of smaller parties in between, none of which has more than 40% or so of the total. So you have a division between the Brahmin Left that supports the center left, the Greens and the Socialists, and the Brahmin Left that supports the far left, La France Insoumise, by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. That is not a tenable alliance, since the center left says the far left will not lead the next government. You have a nearly equal number of seats held by the center, which, if you look at the demographics, the elite that is doing well economically voted for the center. The elite that is not doing well economically, income-wise, voted for the left. Mm-hmm. And that alliance is divided between three main parties from center-left to center-right. And then you have that even those two groups, seven parties plus hangers-on, are not a majority of the parliament. To get a majority of the parliament, well, they are a majority, but then you'd have to let the far left in. If you don't want to let the far left in, you have to add the center-right Republicans in. So my point is, if the victory is holding back national populism for one more election cycle, it was a win. If the success is defined as being able to set the course of a new France, it was very much not a win. There is only one consensus in the current French election, which is we're not yet ready to give National Rally full power. But let's point out that they got 37.5% in the second round, with 39 of their best constituencies where they got 50% of the vote or more in the first round off the table. They probably secured 40 to 43% of the total French vote. That's a very good point.
I actually hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. And so you look at that and say, basically, the people in the center who aren't crazy with the left, but who aren't crazy with Macron, flinched from saying we're now crazy about National Rally. That may not be true in 2 years. So if you're of a mind to engage in Weimar Germany comparisons, which many, not you, because you know something about this. But,
I know some actual history, yeah.
Yes, you know some actual history. But for those who are engaged in, like the New Republic putting a picture of Trump in the style of Hitler on their new cover, because it's Weimar Germany again. This is the 19th.
New Republic, it's kind of sad what happened to them, isn't it? I mean, I can remember when they were like a touchstone of reasonable, intellectually informed debate and discussion that leaned to the left. Boy, is that not true anymore.
Well, it's increasingly difficult to find an element on the left that does not engage in this to some degree. And that's why I'm saying is that if you're engaged in this French election was Weimar 1930, where you had the Nazis at 18% and the communists at 31%, and the parties of the center, from center left to center right, barely having a majority. And what we found was they could not govern. And 2 years later, the dam broke. Why did the dam broke? Because they could not govern.
Boom.
Because they increasingly relied on an elderly president to rule by decree. This case will have a young president ruling by decree. The fact is, you can only hold back the tides of populism if you respond to populist concerns. And there is no inclination that the Brahmin Left or its centrist allies in Macron's ensemble is willing to actually engage with income inequality, regional massive disparities in the distribution of economic opportunity, and mass immigration and the threats to French culture. That the platform of the New Popular Front is precisely designed to ignore all of those concerns, and Macron has clearly shown 7 years in power that he's not willing to seriously address them. So you have to look and think it was a repudiation of the right, but not a final victory over the right.
So what, if anything, do you think this new government, if and when it forms, will actually do, or will literally do nothing other than fiddle, as it were, as the country goes up in flames around it?
Yeah, well, I think the odds are it will fiddle. That you look and you say, Mélenchon controls the largest block of deputies in the New Popular Front, and he is not moderating at all.
No.
And
that's not how he rolls.
That's not how he rolls. And so you look and you say, is it plausible to think that you can have an 8-party government ranging from the center-right Republicans to the center-left socialists agree on anything other than a continuation of the status quo? Well, the socialists say, no, actually, the repeal of Macron's pension law is non-negotiable. Well, do you think the center-right that basically sacrificed its political future to support that pension law when it was forced through, according to the provisions of Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, that enables the president and the government to submit a bill as a thing of no confidence, effectively?
Right.
Are they going to go back on that? Well, they might as well just tell their voters, why don't you go vote? You should have voted for National Rally the first time, because that's your only option for change. It's not plausible to see how this works on anything other than either a decree-based or a least common denominator-based government. And I think that just fuels the desire for change, because it's quite clear French want to change, but they're not comfortable yet with the direction of the change. But maybe these guys can show greater degree of statesmanship or leadership. But if the 3-party German government can't do work in coordination with one another in a meaningful way, which they haven't been able to, I don't see how an 8-party French government can.
Yeah, it does seem pretty unlikely. I mean, I guess you could argue that this is actually a good outcome for the National Rally if you just look a few moves ahead in the chess game. I mean, here they are. They're going to be the opposition to what looks like pardon my French, a total clusterfuck of a government. So, yeah, I mean, this...
Imagining the French of that, le faute du cluster.
So she's ready to pick up the pieces, I mean, if everybody is like in and around this shambolic government that, will eventually be formed that does nothing that people like, then it's great to be on the outside,
Right. So and then you've got, what's the response? The response in the last few days has been, guess what? They're going to investigate her for campaign finance violations. Oh my, how does putting your main political opponent on trial work? Did it work for the left with Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu or Trump? No, but hey, maybe third time's lucky.
That's right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, no, I hear you, brother. I think that's pretty astute assessment of where we are in France. So let's move to the UK. And I guess, one of the interesting things about the, Labour's smashing victory, well, of course, as I think most people followed this at all know, it wasn't really a smashing popular vote victory because they only got, 35%. So for this
34,
level of dominance of the government, it's pretty... In fact, didn't they get a lower share and a lower number of votes than Corbyn did in 2019? I think. Isn't that right?
2017. They got a lower share. They got a slightly higher share from 2019, but a lower share from 2017.
Right. Okay, so this isn't like people rising up in their gazillions and saying we love labor. It's more like we hate the friggin' Tories and we'll vote for you because you're not the Tories. But couldn't you argue that if you look at the demographics of the vote, I mean, it is remarkable how uniform the support is across educational levels. And, the British have this occupational classification system where they didn't do much worse, if at all, among the working class than they did among higher occupational classifications. So is this finally the Brahmin left breaking through to something different, right? I mean, this was Morgan McSweeney's concept, I think, is we're going to reorient the party in such a way that it can appeal to the working class. We're going to put the sort of the lives and benefits and material status of the working class first and foremost. We're not going to be that old Blairite party anymore. We're going to be something really different, and we're going to moderate our social positions, and we're going to, et cetera, et cetera. So do you think, can you make that case that this is a breakthrough for the Brahmin left, that they be de-Brahminized?
Well, I think the proof is in the pudding, that Joe Biden basically ran on the return to normalcy. And what we found was as soon as he got into government, he shifted to the left to appease the left. That is not to say that Joe Biden is an out-and-out progressive in the modern sense of the word, but he clearly governed more to the left than he campaigned in that way. And the question for Starmer is going to be, can he do the same thing? That you do have challenge in upper income areas from the Liberal Democrats who won 72 seats. And there are some upper income areas in the Southeast that Labor did win, where you can see if they're not Brahmin enough, those Labor voters would say, hey, the Liberal Democrats are a reasonable alternative to the Tories. You have a Green Party that jumped up to 6% nationwide, got 4 seats as opposed to 1, but would be a clear receptacle of votes of the disappointed left if they wanted to establish some leverage. And then you had the interesting case of the Muslim independent protest vote that took 4 seats in inner city areas, came very close in about 4 to 6 other seats. And one can easily imagine that would grow stronger rather than grow weaker if what Starmer does is continue to govern as he campaigned, which is to say largely from the center left. I think the proof is going to be in the pudding. And if they can deliver it off, they should have more left-wing defections over time to try and reorient labor to the left. And they have to be willing to stand that. That's something that the Biden administration has not been willing to stand. They move far enough to the left to keep from there being an open break. And if Starmer is willing to see support drain from his left, one can imagine that some of these people who voted for reform, who were easily the second party in Labor's working class strong areas, getting 25 to 35% of the vote throughout what used to be called the Red Wall, that some of those people will say, hey, I was for Brexit. I was against a Tory party against a Labour Party that abandoned me in the Blair-Brown era, but they're back. And you can see them gaining some of those votes back. But the proof is going to be in the pudding. I'd say first step victory, but you have to govern. You can't just campaign. And governing in a majoritarian system is tough because you have to be big tent enough to incorporate many factions. But when the factions are increasingly at odds over fundamentals, it becomes harder and harder to do. And that's going to be Starmer's challenge. He's basically put a bludgeon to the left, and they're willing to go along with it for power. If he continues to put a bludgeon to the left in government, I suspect that they will find other alternatives to show him that he's not the boss of them.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that, Henry. I'm not so convinced that the real problem here would be defections to the left. I think there could really be defections to the right, given that they're, basically they picked up a ton of Tory-leaning working class voters, right? Some went to Reform, but a lot went to Labor. And they're going to expect things to get better. Now, the problem is that the UK is in a terrible economic situation, low productivity growth, kind of a sclerotic economy in general. And to some extent, the biggest idea that Labour has about how to get the British economy its groove back is the Green Prosperity Plan.
Yeah.
And maybe I don't have to convince you that this may not actually work. But there's a huge section of the Labour Party that is very committed to this. Ed Miliband is kind of a nut about this stuff. I mean, he's totally, in the tank for we must have this green transition. We must have it as fast as possible. And I think the energy realities of the British economy, not to mention the world economy, let's just think about it really doesn't work that well. And it isn't the key to prosperity. I mean, it could be, some transition energy program could be part of a key to, or part of a program that could revitalize the British economy. But it seems to me they're pretty much all in on this green stuff. They've dialed back a little bit of it in the campaign, right? I mean, they did walk back some of the more ostentatious pledges, but they've still got quite a few of them that I think someone like Ed Miliband is going to be determined to push forward. And I don't see the economics of this working out too well. And if the economics of it doesn't work out too well, don't you have a lot of, sort of reluctantly Tory defectors who voted Labour, people like that, people on the red wall saying, well, what have you done for me lately? You're no better than the Tories. In fact, you're worse. So, to me, that would be the bigger problem than, social liberals who defect to the left because they're not militant enough on trans issues or what have you.
Well, what I was thinking was, yes, I actually agree with you that is a real threat. But this is the thing, is that if you want to govern genuinely from the center, which is to say to put the economic well-being of working class voters at the heart of your agenda, you have to scale back things like the Green New Deal. Mm-hmm. You have to do things like reinvigorate investment in left-behind areas. And this is part of what their pledge, that we're not going to increase VAT, we're not going to increase national insurance, which is their version of Social Security taxes, and we're not going to increase income taxes, meant to do. And that has bothered the left, because that means you can't adopt the sort of big spending programs that the New Popular Front proposes. You can't use government spending to artificially bring income gains to left-behind areas. If they also go what they try and do is have half the baby, which say we're going to write off these spending investment gains, but we're going to give you the Green New Deal, then I suspect what you see is defection from the left of people who say you have not delivered prosperity, but if you hadn't shackled yourself, you would have. Mm-hmm. And defection of the working class to the right, who says, we trusted you to bring back prosperity and you haven't delivered. And this is the problem of governing a large party where you're not willing to let one wing go. And, if I were them, I would say we are a working class party, really. And if people in Putney and if people in Birmingham Yardley and people in Canterbury don't like it, or Oxford or Cambridge, all places that are highly educated that Labour now runs don't like it, well, there's a party they can support. It's called the Green Party. They are running as a neo-socialist party. Go.
Right.
But we're going to govern from the center. We represent the British working man and woman. We always have and we always will. And if you're not a Fabian on board with this,
right.
Toodaloo. I don't think they're willing to do that, which means I think the likeliest thing is actually they're going to be betwixt and between from the left and the right.
Yeah, the Fabian socialists, they don't get enough love these days, I mean, they're good people. Good people. Well, they were going to be a working class party for realsies. I mean, this is like one of the sort of most mysterious, hard to really wrap your mind around how the entire Western left became enamored of this sort of green New Deal, Green Prosperity Plan, rapid transition to renewables. That's going to be the key. That's going to bring, benefits to everybody. This is not a working class program. Working class people are interested in this stuff. I mean, it is a project of the elites, right? Mm-hmm. And yet it is completely taken over the commanding heights of all the left parties. I mean, how does this happen? In particular, this this development never ceases to surprise me. How, it's almost like a crusade, a religious commitment, something.
Well, if your readers have or listeners haven't figured out, I am on the center right rather than the center left. So I'm going to give you a perspective, comments driven by that perspective. There is, I think, among people across the center left and going over to the left, a lingering to strong belief that planning is better than markets, that markets lead to bad results. They may lead to aggregate growth, but they don't lead to well-distributed growth. They create externalities of poverty. They create externalities of discrimination. So if that's your mindset, saying that, hey, here's this thing that's true, anthropogenic global warming, can be solved by the very thing that has been rejected in the neoliberal consensus in the last 30 years, which is the centrality of state direction. It becomes very attractive to say, aha, this validates my belief about markets. And so it sets in very well with many of the people who tend to think that markets are a failure in their most or even largely deregulated forms. Mm-hmm. And once you get into that, the idea that you can plan your way to broad prosperity, that this is a win-win, becomes a much easier lift than if you're not in that world. And so I listen to these people, and they never really answer the questions of, will the jobs this create go to the same people of the jobs that you destroy? Will the jobs that this creates be in the same places that these jobs that you destroy will be? Are people actually willing to pay in their daily life the costs that they will have to pay for this transition? And they regularly either avoid the question or wish away the realities. And what we've been seeing in Europe in the last 5 years is whenever these costs are posed, whether it is Germany's Greens having to retreat on forcing people to buy heat pumps rather than gas-powered boilers, or whether it is not necessarily mandates for EVs, but attacks on agriculture, things that impose real pain on real people, they end up retreating, and the people get punished at the ballot box. And it still doesn't seem to cause any retreat. And this gets to your last point, which was, this seems like a religious faith. Yeah, this is a faith in an idea. The idea that, of course, state planning of some degree is better than other forms of societal organization. And it's one that they are, if you abandon that, then the question is, why aren't you in the center or on the center right? And they're simply unwilling to abandon it, even in the face of economic and political reality.
Yeah, I don't think it works, though, without the apocalypticism that's connected to it, right? Because surely nothing could better justify an aggressive approach to planning an energy transition than, if we don't do it, our collective gooses are cooked. The apocalypse is coming. The catastrophe is imminent. It's all hands on deck. I've debated people, Margaret Salomon, who's head of the group that funds Just Stop Oil, and her shtick is like, this is such an incredible problem that we basically need a World War II style mobilization for decades, right? To avert this. And, if that's in your mind, that this is, a crisis on that level, then, you could sort of see where it sort of makes sense. You should do this stuff. And, I'm more of obviously on the left than you are, Henry, and I'm sympathetic to industrial policy wisely conceived and done in partnership with the private sector, and, pumping up competitive industry. There's a point to that. You look at the history of America, there's been various flavors of industrial policy forever. But the sort of the green-driven industrial policy is like a solution in search of a problem when you take the apocalypse out of it, because you're taking a perfectly well-functioning energy system and you're like grafting all this other stuff onto it, and, doing huge subsidies and other things that are not particularly efficient economically, and assuming it'll all turn out well. And, I wrote a piece about this recently on my Substack, Green Lash is Here. We see it most acutely, as you pointed out, in Europe, but I do think do think it's coming. Anyway, I should get off my soapbox about that. But that is something that never ceases to surprise me as an old man of the left who is oriented toward, the welfare of the working class and sort of economic dynamism and prosperity for the society, which lifts up everybody, blah, blah, blah.
Of course, during the classic period of the left, the apocalypse was always the next Great Depression. That the Great Depression legitimized the critique of capitalism that had been levied from the left and amplified the depth to which those who held it believed it. So it was always, if we don't move more in this direction, it's going to be another Great Depression, because that's the inherent problem of the market. So to me, I look at this and say, green apocalypticism is simply the updating of that. But I would also say, if you really believed that, why do you resist nuclear power? Which, Bernie Sanders in 2020 is asked that, and he says, well, there's this problem with nuclear waste. And it's like, okay, certain planetary destruction and a way to save it, or minor manageable problems with nuclear waste.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
AOC said 8 years ago that we have 10 years to save the planet. Okay, we're 8 years into that. Got 2 years left to save the planet.
Right.
Are you
let's
getting
enjoy
worried
our 2
yet?
years.
Yeah, let's. So my point is, you can't even take this seriously,
right?
Because if it's like the World War II metaphor is actually over and over again mentioned in AOC's Green New Deal resolution, which I've written about. We need a mobilization, and my argument is, one, who's the enemy, and what is victory?
Right.
Is that in history, people are willing to undergo temporary mobilizations to save themselves, as long as you can see victory at the end of the corner. And the question is, who's the enemy? Well, the enemy is the planet. Well, the enemy is us dealing with the planet. When you can't control that, you can't control Chinese emissions, you can't control Indian emissions, you can't control Indonesian emissions. They will destroy the planet, even if we are perfect, in this mindset. Yeah. And two, victory means ending the controls. It's like, we had rationing during World War II, but when we didn't have World War II, we ended rationing. There is no end in sight. It's a permanent regime because the planetary climate is, permanent. And you look at this and say, why do you think people would freely go along with this?
Yes, right.
There is no element of human history or human nature that suggests that people will willingly go along with it.
Approximately 0 sense, as I've tried to point out, and as you eloquently are demonstrating. Well, enough of this agreeing stuff. Let's move on to something else. We'll probably agree on this too, but I know what everybody's thinking about is listening to this podcast is, what on earth is going on in this country? What is going to happen with Joe Biden? How did the Democrats get into this pickle? Is their goose completely cooked? So, Henry, give us your take on where we are right now. And also, I believe you argued Biden will inevitably step down anyway. I don't know if you revised that in the last few days, but give us your perspective on what's going on.
I do think that Biden will still step down because the internal logic of it is too great. When you have people like Nancy Pelosi delivering veiled attacks on Biden. Yes, I support Biden, and it's his decision as to whether to run. Well, he's said it's his decision. If you really supported Biden, you would say, he said on Monday he's in. Let's do it.
Right.
But the fact that you don't do that means you don't. Right. So the thing is that, first of all, we got to this point because people on the center left and the left, but mainly the center left, were unwilling to actually call the bluff, which is that it was the right massively exaggerated Biden's problems in 2021 and 2022, but Joe Biden was not demented and a puppet president and so forth.
He's sharp
but
as a tack.
It was the Fox News fallacy, as you pointed out. If Fox says it, the opposite must be the case.
True, yeah.
The truth was Fox was exaggerating, and Joe Biden was an old man in decline, and visibly so. And the alternative, though, to going along with the White House, nothing to see here, which is kind of like that scene in The Naked Gun where Leslie Nielsen is standing in front of an exploding fireworks factory with everything going off, and he says, "Nothing to see here. Move on."
Right.
You remember when Biden being escorted off the stage at the G7 summit a month ago was decried as a cheap fake by the White House and repeated.
Right. Oh, and there was a 2-minute freeze in the Juneteenth, dance celebration or whatever. Yeah, I mean, it's all out of context, cheap fake, whatever. Yeah.
Right, yeah. A 20-second freeze by Mitch McConnell is the end of the republic, and a 2-minute freeze by Joe Biden is a cheap fake. I mean, so there's a but the thing is, it actually kind of makes sense, which is that the Democratic Party is a party where the center left is barely holding on against an insurgent left populist wing.
Mm-hmm.
And the alternative to the reality denial is the reality acceptance. The reality acceptance is Joe Biden can't do this, so we need a new nominee. And Kamala Harris would have had to fight like heck to become the new nominee, given her own weaknesses. So you would have had a bloodbath in the party had the truth been acknowledged when it should have been acknowledged last September. And people, I think, there were rational reasons to think, well, maybe we can cobble this together. Maybe people have motivated reasoning. And that's as true on the right as the left. I'm not saying that this is a left wing. This is a human phenomena. But the thing is that Biden has obviously deteriorated much more quickly in the last year. And you can't undo 90 minutes of live television. And so that's why we're where we're at. And I think eventually Biden will step aside because there are too many people who know the truth, which is that he can't do it. He will get worse over the next 4 months, not better. There will be some episode, may not be 90 minutes, but there will be some significant episode where he freezes or he fumbles or something. It's unavoidable given his condition. And they look ahead and say, this is a man who has to win the popular vote by 2 points to have a chance of carrying the Electoral College.
Yes.
And he was behind by 1 before the debate. He's behind by 3 now. And this is when he has had a opponent who's been tied up by being at a trial and has been outspent by hundreds of millions of dollars. That's not going to be true in the fall. He's not going to be at a trial because that's what the immunity decision guaranteed. There won't be Donald Trump tied down in Miami or Washington or Atlanta. And the Trump campaign now has more cash to spend the Biden campaign. Does anyone think that Joe Biden can make up a 3-point deficit with the lowest job approval ratings of any president in history at this stage in his first term?
Okay, so
everyone
Biden
looks at this and says, it's obvious he has to go.
Okay, but what if he doesn't? What if he does manage to stick in there? Is it completely disaster then in your view? I mean, it's like a Trump landslide? Or at minimum, there's no way he can win. Is that your view? I mean, it's a question of how badly
I never like certain, it's like what happens if, when I say no way, and then Xi invades Taiwan or blockades Taiwan, and America defeats the China. There's always scenarios I can invent that provide the sort of temporary impetus. In October of 1979, Jimmy Carter looked like a goner. By December, he was ahead in the polls because of the rally round effect after the seizure of the hostages in Iran. Can I discount that possibility? No. But I look ahead and I say, people with 40% job approval ratings don't get reelected. People who are losing the matchup on all of the important issues that matter to swing voters, as Biden has been for months to Donald Trump, don't get reelected. And then you have the undercurrent that nobody wants to talk about, which is the Democratic Party has entered every presidential election since 1932 with an advantage in voter identification. More people say they are Democrats than Republicans. That will not be true this year for the first time since the Great Depression. The Republicans have been gaining in voter registration. They've been gaining in partisan identification. They will go in with a voter edge. No one in the Democratic Party has incorporated that for the first time in history. They can't just rally the base and split the independents. They have to rally the base and win the independents 55 to 45 to have a prayer of winning the presidential vote. They don't know how to do it. All of their campaigns is geared towards rally the base and split the independents. I can imagine a scenario where Biden wins, but particularly given the fact that Trump can just say, you may not like me, but oh, by the way, at least I can work 14 hours a day and put three sentences together that don't start in one place and end up with "we beat Medicare."
Yeah, right. No, that's an excellent point about the party ID stuff. I do think like nobody is paying attention to it. It's actually quite important and revealing. Okay, so under your probable scenario, though, I mean, Biden doesn't make it all the way to November. He is somehow replaced. So
Right.
What's your view about how that happens and who is likely his replacement? Is it almost for sure Kamala, or you think there's something else? And, the big question, if they did replace him with somebody, candidate X, can candidate X actually mount some sort of comeback and manage to beat Trump? Or are we really talking about, sort of display my cards here? I think basically you're getting a slightly higher probability of winning, but it's probably still not above 50%, right? Trump's probably still going to win. It's maybe just a question of, reducing, having a better chance and maybe having a smaller margin. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. I think that, one, the likeliest nominee would be Kamala in the absence of Biden because it's the least disruptive scenario.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you were going to do that, you should tell Biden to resign the presidency and make her the president.
Right.
And the reason why is otherwise you have a 1968 scenario where you have a president in charge of the agenda and a vice president who desperately needs to create their own identity, but is unable to do so because they don't command the levers of power. This is Hubert Humphrey desperately needing a cessation of bombing in northern Vietnam, and it doesn't come until 3 days before the election. He surges, but it's too late. And I think if you're going to go in for a dime, in for a dollar, if you're going to go for Kamala as the nominee, you should make her president and let her sink or swim on her own. Barring that, I think the strongest theoretical ticket is Gretchen Whitmer and Raphael Warnock running as a team, because you have a woman and a black. Mm-hmm. You need to energize women. It's very difficult in the modern American political democracy for Democrats to win a national victory without winning blacks 90-10. Winning 75-25 or 80-20 is insufficient. You cannot carry Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Georgia by winning only 85-15 or 80-20. You must win it 90-8, 90-10. And I think Raphael Warnock can excite black voters in a way.
Why wouldn't Kamala be able to do that then?
If Kamala could do that, she wouldn't have dropped out before Iowa. I mean, who saved Joe Biden? Black voters. Why did black voters prefer Joe Biden to Kamala Harris? Because Kamala Harris doesn't excite black voters. I do think the man who succeeded Martin Luther King as the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Georgia, and who has won 2 very tough races in purple Georgia in the last 3 years, is somebody who can incite black voters. And I think you need to have, again, cut the cord. If the problem is the administration, cut the cord to the administration. If you jump in with a successful 52 or 50, I always forget whether Gretch, I guess she's big Gretch and about ready to do her book tour. I forget whether she's 52 or 54, but she's clearly not part of the administration. She's clearly a generation younger. So is Warnock. And I look at this and I think you can't get a better, and 2 swing states, Michigan and Georgia. You hold Michigan and one other Midwestern state, and you hold Georgia, and you win.
Right.
You win. And so I look at this and I think this would be your best ticket. But I understand why you probably won't get there, because you'd have to fight to get there. And it's very hard to fight.
I mean, this is a theoretical case that I think has considerable plausibility, but it is a theoretical case. And in all likelihood, it's either Biden limps through to the election, or she's in one way, manner, shape, or form replaced by Harris. So I think in both of those cases, it sounds like we both agree you probably lose. The question of, the scale of the defeat maybe wouldn't be that different from Harris or Biden. Let's say that happens. Okay, what does that mean in terms of, well, here's my question. Is this a last hurrah for the Brahmin Left? I mean, is this finally the model's run out of gas? It just not working? Would this force a rethink in the party towards something that was a little bit different? Because look, if you look at the New York Times poll, Biden is down over 20 points among working class voters writ large. That's astonishing. That's huge. Mm-hmm. If anything like that happens in this election, wouldn't people, start to think, well, look, we can't build our party off the backs of a bunch of college-educated liberals in the big metropolitan areas. Yeah. This does not compute as political arithmetic. So could it possibly be a transition point away from the kind of politics we've seen in the last 20 or 30 years?
Well, I think part of the deeper the defeat, the likelier the rethink, which is to say Republicans have not held more than 55 Senate seats since the election of 1928. If Donald Trump wins the national vote by 5 points, which would be the largest Republican victory since 1988, he will carry Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. He will come very close in Maine. Mm-hmm. He will come very close and perhaps could carry Minnesota. What do we know? Yeah. Arizona's Senate seat is up. Nevada's Senate seat is up. Montana's Senate seat is up. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. You could see Republicans holding 57 Senate seats in a Trump plus 5, the highest mark they have been since Babe Ruth was a star for the New York Yankees.
Okay, Henry, the obvious counter to this
is would scare Democrats dramatically.
Okay, but the obvious counter to that is, and I know you've written about this, so I'm just teeing you up here, the Senate candidates are all running way ahead of Biden in these states. I mean, 7, 8, 9 points. So why would we think just because Trump is a big victory that he would manage to drag these Republican Senate candidates over the line when they're behind now as much as they are?
So 2 reasons. One is all of these Democratic incumbents are better known than the Republican alternative. They're incumbents. They've been around for, 6, 12, 18 years. And you just look at all the polls, and there's a huge name ID gap. I pointed this out in 2018, when at this point in 2018, Phil Bredesen was leading Marsha Blackburn in Tennessee, and everyone said, oh, gosh, maybe this moderate Democrat can pull it off. And you look at the polls and you say, well, let's look underneath. Marsha Blackburn is losing Eastern Tennessee to Phil Bredesen. Is that plausible? Well, this is the part of Tennessee that has always voted for Republicans since the Civil War. Why did Bredesen have the leads? Because no one knew who Marsha Blackburn is. Right now, the Republican candidate is behind a name ID. I will pay attention to the Senate polls when the Republican has caught up in name ID. When the Republican candidate has caught up in name ID to the Democratic candidate, then I will take the Senate polls seriously. What we know is that will happen because Republicans will spend their way to making it happen. And what we know in the modern era is that in a presidential year, it is very rare when a candidate wins a Senate seat when the president loses that same state. That did not happen in 2016 and 2020. Olympia Snowe defied the polls and did it in Maine. But other than that, if you win the state, the Senate candidate wins the state. So I look at this and I think Trump plus 1, I could see a Democrat running a couple points ahead of Biden. Biden loses Michigan by 1 and Alessa Slotkin wins Michigan by 1. I can see that. Trump plus 5? Well, then he's winning all these states by 3 or 4. Do I think Tammy Baldwin's going to run 5 points ahead of Joe Biden in a presidential year? No.
Okay, very interesting. Brother Olsen, last question here. Last question. Okay, here we are. It's 2025. Trump won the election fairly handily. He's got a trifecta because, obviously he'll control the Senate because they just need the West Virginia seat, and maybe they'll get a lot more, as you're arguing.
Well, if he wins the presidency, all he needs is West Virginia because he's got the vice president.
Exactly. So, and then, probably they hold the House. Okay, so it's a trifecta, second Trump term. What do they do that's good? What do they do that's bad, insofar as you can, guess as to what they might be up to?
Well, I think that depends on what you mean by good and bad.
Well, good and bad in your view.
Good and bad in my view. I think a bad thing is that they extend the tax cuts and pass new ones. I think America has a debt crisis, and it needs to deal with that. And my argument is that you can do it in a populist way, which is remove the tax breaks and subsidies that go to the well-off. If we treated Harvard the way we treat GM, they would pay a couple billion instead of
I'm for that.
tens of
Screw
millions.
Harvard, man. We need some of that money.
And the same thing is true with things on the tax code. Why is it that rich people get to deduct their mortgage interest or exclude their health insurance premiums? You make $400,000 a year. You don't need that help to buy a house or buy a health insurance. So, I think if you add this up, you can get a significant amount, not to close our deficit. I think Republicans will go in the opposite direction. That's a bad thing. I think a good thing that they will do is they will amp up the Made in America programs. And I think that they will lean into Republican orthodoxy on taxes. They will lean against it on trade and manufacturing industrial policy. And I think that is a good thing. It is a good thing from national security. We do not want to be dependent on countries that are either China or within the Chinese military orbit. You hear a lot of businessmen say, well, I want to, sure, we can get out of China. Let's go to Vietnam. Have you looked at who controls military access to Vietnam? The Chinese could easily cut off any imports from Vietnam. It is not in our interest to have our country dependent on imports from Vietnam any more than it is from China. And I think we need to have, for national defense and for social cohesion, more high-paying jobs that either flow downstream from or are manufacturing jobs. And I think Trump will move in that direction, and I think that is a good thing. I think Trump will not want to do anything abortion policy nationally. He will not sign. No national abortion ban is going to come out of that Congress.
Yes,
Trump will make clear that that's not going to happen. I think pro-lifers will be disappointed with what the appointments to HHS he'll give them some things, but he will not. He does not want abortion to be a national policy. And so I think that is, I am a pro-lifer. I would like to see more abortions outlawed because I think the taking of ending of a pregnancy, particularly once the heart and the brain start to form in and around week 6, is the taking of a human life. But I recognize the politics of it, which is from the politics of it, you don't want to be on that side on a national issue. So I think that will be something that will split Republicans. I think they will move dramatically to de-wokeify industry, the academy, and the government. And I think that is generally a good thing. The Brahmin Left, as you call it, will scream holy murder. But I think largely the American people will be supportive as long as they don't overstep. I think you will see a challenge to the Civil Service Act because I think Schedule F will be reinstituted. They will say the executive power of the office is held in the president, and when you protect people who actually make policy rather than people who are clerks and technicians and port authority people, who simply administer things, it's one thing to say we have an interest in fighting corruption, so therefore you can't clean out all 2 million people and replace them with your unqualified cronies. It is completely a different thing to say people in high civil service positions who actually implement policy should be immune from presidential directive. I think they will challenge that with Schedule F. I think we'll end up at the Supreme Court, and I think they will win. And I think that is a good thing. And then on foreign policy, I am a guarded internationalist, which is I think that the international web of alliances that we have built in the last 80 years are in our interest and should be maintained. And our allies have tended not to hold up their part of the bargain in the post-Berlin Wall era. And we do not have the military to sustain our commitments. So I think that to the degree that Trump reinterprets that order so that we're going to say, we'll be in NATO, but you guys have to get serious or we're going to start withdrawing things, elements of our support structure, like no more bases in Germany because we need those troops elsewhere. I think a remodulation of our alliance structure is a good thing. The abandonment of it would be a bad thing. And I think that's the great open question of the Trump administration. Really? It could be good in the sense of finally convincing our allies that they have to burden share, which allows us to reconcentrate our forces in areas where we have clear, stronger interests without increasing our defense budget to 5% of GDP. I think if what Trump did was follow through on some of the more blustery comments, which is basically withdraw from NATO and treat everything as a financial transaction, maybe not be isolationist, but go towards America on its own, I think that would be a very bad thing.
Absolutely.
And that is, I think, the great unanswered question of a Trump second term.
Right. Well, there you have it. Those are very plausible assessments, it seems to me, what you said, Henry. And we might vary in how we assess their goodness or badness, but I do think that's a lot of what's in play. Of course, you left out the real plan, which is how the jackbooted thugs are going to round up all the people on the left and put them in concentration camps because, it's like fascism, man. But, leaving that aside, there's a lot to chew on.
My question about the democracy is over crowd is literally how does it happen?
Well,
again, this gets to the history thing. When Hitler took over Germany, it required the cooperation of the military. It required the cooperation of all of the institutions. Basically, when fascism happens, it happens because the elites don't believe in democracy, and they go along with it. Does anyone believe that the American General Staff is going to say, well, yeah, let's arrest Nancy Pelosi because that's what our elected president does. We have a decentralized election. Does anyone think that any of the states are going to go along and say one vote, one time? That's insane.
Right, yeah. Not to mention the lack of hundreds of thousands of paramilitaries fighting in the streets in the years leading up to the end of the Weimar Republic. But, Henry, let's not confuse the issue with facts here. I think the democracy will be over. A crowd are going to believe that that's the case until it's considerably after Trump starts his second term, and they'll probably still believe it. I mean, everything that happens that's a little bit weird will be sort of put into the stew as a marker of impending fascism. But that need not detain us, because I think you've set out what really are the policy stakes of a Trump administration, the things that could be good, could be bad, the things he's plausibly going to be considering doing in conjunction with his administration. And maybe we all better start thinking about it, because it does seem more probable than not at this point. Sorry out there, my fellow Democrats, but them's the way, it looks right now. So, Henry, I just want to thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. I mean, I really do urge people to follow Henry in whatever forum you want, on Twitter/X, in his columns in the National Review and New York Post, and just generally, seek him out wherever you can. He's one of America's most astute political analysts, and I always learn stuff from listening to him, and you will too. So, check him out. Anyway, that's it for now. See you in a couple weeks with another fabulous guest.
Well, and thank you for the endorsement. People on the right should be reading you every week in the Liberal Patriot, as I do, and listening to your podcast.
Oh, thank you, Henry. Thank you.
I disagree with you on many policies, but you are an honest man of the left and come at things and deal in a fact-based world. Heaven forbid.
Heaven forbid.